Uh, Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the first talk of Monday Talks or Pazartesi konuşmalar organized by the Department of Turkish Language and Literature at Boğaziçi University. We are very delighted to host Kristin Dickinson from the University of Michigan. I'm going to introduce her first, then she will give her talk, and then we will have a question and answer discussion part where you can either ask your questions by writing or you can just raise your hands and ask your questions, orally in a way. Kristin Dickinson is the Assistant Professor of German Studies, and affiliated faculty in Comparative Literature and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. With a focus on questions of migrations, multilingualism, and world literature, her research addresses the long history of German Ottoman Turkish transcultural contact from 1800 to the present. Through a comparative approach, her book and articles highlight the significance of the Turkish cultural and historical archive for our contemporary understanding of Germanness, and vice versa. In doing so, they also challenge racial, ethno-linguistics, and geopolitical definitions of German and Turkishness, which persists despite generations of Turkish German living, writing, and creating in Germany today. Her book, DisOrientations, German-Turkish Cultural Contact in Translation, 1811-1946, appeared with Penn State University Press in 2021. Focusing on the translations, literature, and legacies of Johann Goethe, Friedrich Schiller, and Sebatzen Ali, this book argues that German and Ottoman Turkish histories of translation were linked across a nearly 150-year time frame. Building on the research for her book, Kristin also gets edited a special issue of the Turkish-German Studies Yearbook on Sebatzen Ali's translingual translationalism, which you can actually find on the internet, which is a very good book. I was very impressed by it. With a particular focus on Sebatzen Ali's relationship to German literature and culture, the articles in this issue underscore the centrality of translation and intertextuality to his literary productions. Kristin also taking up questions of Turkish language reform and its relation to ethnicized understandings of Turkishness and Germanness, respectively, in a separate articles on Bilge Karasöz, Göçmüş Kediler Bahçesi, and Zafer Şenocak's Köşk. Her most recent article also challenges ethno-linguistic definitions of Germanness through its focus on Emine Sevgi Özdemar's intertextual experimentation with the life and work of German Jewish author Else Schiller in the novel Strange Stars Stare to Earth. Kristin's forthcoming publication include an article on multilingualism in translation in the Afrofuturist writings of Black German author Sharon Otto for PMLA, and an article on haptic aesthetics of Zafer Şenocak's Turkish language poetry, which forged a multilingual and intertextual archive through its reference to Paul Celan and Yunus Emre, which seems very interesting. Kristin is also an active translator. What cannot do, Kristin? Her translations of Ahmet Haşim, Sebatzen Ali, Feridun Zaimoğlu, Zafer Şenocak, and others have appeared in Europe Now, the Turkish-German Studies Yearbook, Words Without Borders, and the Chicago Review. She has recently translated Zafer Şenocak's collected Turkish poetry, İlk Işık and Kıyı ve Kabuklar, and is preparing to submit these for publication. Kristin additionally manages the public humanities project translatingmichigan.org and is the curator of the photography exhibit Visualizing Translation, Homeland and Heimat in Detroit and Dortmund, which premiered in Ann Arbor, Michigan in October, November 2021, and is currently on display in Marquette, Michigan through the end of March 2022. Her current book project, Visualizing Translation, Belonging Beyond Citizenship in Contemporary Germany, aims to build on the materials in this exhibition to ask how contemporary artists with a migration background in Germany enact processes of translation that challenge visual perceptions of Germanness linked to whiteness. Her talk today will focus on her recent book, DisOrientations, German-Turkish Cultural Context in Translation. Kristin, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Would you like to unmute your mic? Yes. Yes. Wait, I'm unmuted right now, right? Yeah, I have a message that says that the host has spotlighted me. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Thank you so much, Halim Hoja, for introducing me. This is especially delightful for me to be able to give this talk, having first discovered some of the materials that ended up in this book while taking a class with you 12 or 13 years ago. And in a way, it was the class that I took with you and those materials that I discovered while living in Istanbul then that inspired me to take on this longer historical project, which I had not really imagined before that. So thank you so much again for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to share my screen. So can everyone see my slides? Yes. So as Halim just noted, my book takes a long view of German-Turkish, including German-Ottoman Turkish cultural relations, through the lens of literary translation from the early 19th century through the mid-20th century. And the book is structured into 3 sections that sort of focus on the life and legacies of these 3 figures: Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Friedrich Schiller, and Sebatzen Ali. These men worked as authors, journalists, and literary translators, and were all sort of enmeshed in these translation networks that I analyze. And importantly, they were all implicated in, but also in different ways transcended the intersecting histories of German scholarly Orientalism and late Ottoman and early Republican Turkish Westernizing reforms. This is important because Orientalism and Westernization alike asserted a one-way movement of modernity from west to east, which was tied to a simplistic understanding of translation as a kind of one-way transfer from an original to a secondary copy. And so within this configuration, German Orientalist translations often served as a mode of gathering knowledge about a Turkish other and discursively fixating it in time and in space. And on the other hand, late Ottoman and modern Turkish authors translating from Western European source texts often understood themselves as doomed to merely replicate what Western literature had already accomplished. The translations that I look at don't conform to this simple kind of one-way movement. By engaging different timeframes, by overlapping with authorial practice, and by linking disparate literary traditions, they do not simply orient themselves toward an original that they are assumed to follow, but they engage in what I describe as a kind of omnidirectional encounter. I built here on Sarah Ahmed's work on the concept of orientation. So according to Ahmed, orientations always involve at least a two-way approach. When we orient ourselves towards someone or something, we are also touched by that person or object. And when we touch something, we are also touched. As a site of contact, orientation does not always affirm our perceived bodily position, but harbors a disorienting potential that can destabilize the boundaries between self and other, between interiority and exteriority. Considering literary translations between German and Ottoman Turkish and modern Turkish as one mode of textual, linguistic, and cultural encounter, I argue in my book that there is no 0 point of translational orientation, and that there is no clearly defined here and there, and by analogy, or no original translation that stand in opposition. As complex sites of connection, the translations that I analyze upend these clear-cut distinctions between original translation, West, East, and past, present. My interest in the historical trajectory of a German-Turkish literary cultural relationship was inspired by the significance of large-scale translation movements for the development of both German and Turkish modern literary cultures, even though these particular histories are rarely read in connection to one another. So in the German context, the development of a German national literary self-awareness can be traced back to Luther's translation of the Bible, which established a common literary language through translation. Luther's translational style was deemed an expansion of the German language, and he was seen as both a reformer and a creator of language by many 18th century scholars. The late 18th and early 19th centuries then witnessed an unprecedented amount of translation in the German context. This slide references just a handful of breakthrough translations from this time period. You see translations from other European languages, and especially from English. You see translations from quote unquote Oriental languages and literatures such as Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, as well as classical texts and particularly ancient Greek. And these translations paved the way for the fields of philology, comparative grammar, textual criticism, hermeneutics, and more. As I'm sure you all know, in the Tanzimat period of the Ottoman Empire, a series of state-sponsored modernizing reforms modeled largely on European practices also marked an important paradigm shift in the history of translation. After centuries of engaging with Arabic and Persian literature through diverse writing practices, the Tanzimat era saw the first translations of Western European source texts. Through their introduction of new literary genres into the Turkish context, such as the novel, the short story, literary criticism, these translations laid the foundation for the formation of modern Turkish literature and were at the forefront of debates regarding language and cultural reform. So what happens when we think about these two histories together? Number one, we realize that German authors utilized translation to posit a very positive and unique sense of cosmopolitan Germanness. And they did this by arguing that translation activity constituted an openness to the world, as well as by upholding the unique flexibility of the German language. On the contrary, amidst a period of profound semiotic reorientation, Turkish authors tended to view the need for translation as a sign of their belatedness vis-a-vis the West, and as a sign of a derivative nature of late Ottoman and modern Turkish literature. So to reiterate one of the main arguments that I make across my book, the concept of belatedness suggests that modern Turkish literature was fundamentally altered in its reorientation toward Western European models in the late 19th century, whereas European literature remained intact in this exchange. To put this another way, the concept of belatedness suggests that there is some fundamentally intact body of European literature that Turkish authors could simply follow in the footsteps of. And in response, I shift the discussion from one of belatedness to one of orientation. By looking at translation as a complex mode of orientation across both time and space, I argue that there is no intact self from which or toward which we can orient ourselves, just as there is no national consciousness that could exist outside of or prior to the play of language. By bringing non-synchronous histories of translation in the German and Turkish contexts into a comparative framework, I also grapple with the discourse of world literature at different points. And this is important because German culture is often imagined as a critical site of inception for world literature, whereas Turkish literature has been historically excluded from this paradigm. Ottoman Turkish literature in particular was shunned by European Orientalists who sought to classify and organize the world according to the historicist model of an evolutionary national history. Emerging exactly in this historical moment, the discourse of Weltliteratur or world literature also sought to make sense of diverse cultures of writing by ordering them into retroactively applied categories of literature from this European lens. Incorporating elements of Arabic and Persian, the Ottoman Turkish language was inherently multilingual and heteroglossic, and it thus defied the Orientalist philologist's search for links between a folk or a people, a geographic area, and a national language. Ottoman divan poetry, which was deeply influenced by Persian, was also deemed inferior and not quote unquote original enough to stand as a national literature in its own right. And as a result, few works of Ottoman literature were translated into German or other European languages. So given this historical framework, section 1 of my book asks what was translated, why was it translated, and how. So across 2 chapters, I linked the first translations from Ottoman Turkish into German, which were first published in 1811, and were then picked up by Goethe and incorporated into his monumental West-East Divan in 1816. And so I linked these to the first translations that were undertaken from German into Ottoman Turkish between 1886 and 1894, which were incidentally of Goethe's earlier novella, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Importantly, the first translations from Ottoman Turkish into German were undertaken by the diplomat Heinrich Friedrich von Dietz, who was strictly speaking outside the circuits of scholarly Orientalism. While Dietz was in contact with and did strongly influence the trajectory of German scholarly Orientalism, his translations and the prefatory materials to his translations are really interesting in that they reverse the standard Orientalist trope that Western scholars are better equipped to preserve knowledge about the East than so-called Orientals themselves. So he describes, for example, European libraries as the graves of Oriental manuscripts, and he figures Ottoman archives in contrast as repositories of knowledge and valuable cultural information. Dietz self-published the majority of his translations in the 2-volume work Memoirs from Asia, which you can see the first volume of here on the left. From among the different sections of this work that Goethe engaged with, I want to give you an example from the Book of Oghuz, which is a collection of approximately 200 proverbs that can be traced back to the Oghuz Turks. Dietz himself emphasized the significance of proverbs as phrases that maintain a unique national character, despite their tendency to move across national lines. And despite Goethe's own interest in proverbs as phrases that somehow reflect on national origin, many of the divan poems inspired by Dietz's work emphasize acts of transgression, suggesting that these proverbs gain value precisely when they exceed the level of the national. So here's an example from the Book of Proverbs, Hikmetname, in the Divan. And Goethe has the succinct couplet, Das Meer flutet immer, das Land behält es nimmer. The sea is flowing ever, the land contains it never. So Goethe's couplet shortens Dietz's translation, which reads as, tritt nicht über wie das Meer und umfasse keine Sache, welche du nicht ausrichten kannst, or don't overflow like the ocean and don't embrace anything you cannot justify. Through its expression of the inevitable, Goethe's couplet takes away the didactic character of the saying. By bringing an opposition between land and water into direct visual focus, it renders the proverb explicit. At the same time, Goethe creates ambiguity in the second line regarding this pronoun it. As the potential object or poetic subject of the line, it refers to the water's inability to cover the land and the land's inability to cover the water. This is a parallel poem from the Book of Proverbs in the Divan, which suggests the significance of this force of flooding, the power of flooding for the realm of poetry. Die Flut der Leidenschaft, sie stürmt vergebens ans unbezwungene feste Land. Sie wirft poetische Perlen an den Strand und das ist schon Gewinn des Lebens. So the flood of passion storms in vain the never conquered solid land. Poetic pearls thrown on the strand. And that for living is a gain. So these two poems are often read as a reflection on the uncontrollable forces of nature. But the shore's inability to contain the poetic flood of passion is figured in Goethe's quatrain here as positive. It suggests the circulation of poetic ideas in which the individual components, shore and land, cover and exceed each other but never merge. They engage in a kind of ebb and flow that undermines simplistic one-way movement. These questions of multidirectionality and excess mark all elements of the Divan that were inspired by Ottoman language sources and translation. And in my book, I argue that this emphasis on excess and on uncontainability is linked to the exceptional role that the Ottoman Empire played within the German discourse of Orientalism. Due to its relative youth and its history of domination in the Middle East and the Balkans, for example, Andrea Polaszek describes the Ottoman Empire as possessing what she terms an excess of presentness, which made it difficult to mythologize or to relegate to an unchanging past. Importantly, questions of excess are also tied to the etymologies of the words Orient and Orientation, which both point toward a problematic concept of worldly self-positioning that developed throughout the 18th century. So in a time of great European expeditions and increased colonial expansion, the need for reliable maps grew immensely, but the impossibility of rendering three-dimensional space accurately on a two-dimensional map, together with the absence of an actually identifiable east-west meridian, rendered the concept of orientation problematic. We might say impossible. Unlike the north-south axis, on which one's relative position can be determined through reference to the stars, there are no earthly signs that reveal one's easterly or westerly location. So in the absence of these kinds of reliable signs, the concept of geographic and cartographic orientation developed into a more specific problem of self-orientation, which in German is expressed through this reflexive verb, sich orientieren, to orient oneself. So consider, for example, the definition of this verb in Grimm's dictionary. Quote, in absence of the compass needle to try to find the excess, namely the east of one's familiar worldly location. That the task of orienting oneself is measured upon the ability to locate the east as opposed to the west is due to the etymology of the word orient. Derived from the Latin oriens, it can be translated into German as sich erhebend, meaning soaring or uplifting, and designates the space of the Orient as the land that lies in the direction of the rising sun. Accordingly, the verb orientieren, to orient, originally meant to turn toward the east. Grimm's quote, which identifies the east as the unknown or excess of an implied west, suggests the development of a problematic form of worldly self-positioning that is impossible to achieve. It points to the inherent meaning of the word orient as a non-locatable space that changes according to one's own position. In other words, any attempt to locate the east inevitably reveals one's own position to be unstable. In my chapter, I point to Goethe's own depiction of Dietz's translations as Sternbilder or constellations. Within the context of the Divan, I argue that Dietz's translations become navigational signs that are nevertheless emblematic of spatial instability and that reveal the impossibility of a kind of clear-cut system of east-west orientation. So throughout the chapter, I argue that Goethe adapts and incorporates translated material by Dietz into the cycles of his Divan, which consistently collapses the distance between Eastern and Western spaces. Given the significance of the Divan itself for Goethe's conceptualization of world literature, I argue that the poetry of the Divan in particular provides for an alternative reading of this concept and an earlier reading of this concept. In his own scattered remarks, which mostly came from the late 1920s, Goethe articulated world literature or Weltliteratur as a Eurocentric form of literary cultural exchange in the service of a self-affirming universal progress. But rather than a concept of literary exchange that leads to a heightened sense of self-orientation, the Ottoman Turkish-inspired elements of the Divan envision a messier form of Weltliteratur as a radical questioning of one's own positionality. With this reading of the Divan in mind, chapter 2 of the book takes up the first translations from Ottoman Turkish into German, which happened some 60 years after the Divan was first published. These translations were undertaken by 5 translators over a course of 8 years, and different letters from the epistolary novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, appeared in literary journals between 1886 and 1894. I read these translations as a kind of debate in practice that preceded the more formal Klassiklertartışması or classics debate, which was started by Ahmet Mithat in 1897. And in this debate, Mithat defined a classic as a European work of literature approximately 100 to 150 years in age, the value of which does not decrease over time. As examples, Mithat cites authors such as Goethe, also Shakespeare, Molière, Racine. And in contrast to the literatures that these European authors represent, Mithat did not believe that Ottoman authors had entered into their own classical period. Mithat's definition reflects emerging opinions of the time that understood literary translation as a means of social reform, of achieving literary and cultural progress, and of catching up with the so-called more developed literatures of Europe. These ideas were conditioned by a worldview that placed Europe at its imagined center and that emphasized the West's originality and uniqueness, which the rest of the world was doomed to imitate after the fact. It is no coincidence that Ottoman conceptions of originality were shifting around this time. Notably, Ottoman lyric poetry did not prize a concept of originality that demanded uniqueness or that praised thoughts which could be traced back to one identifiable author. So Walter Andrews, for example, writes that the situation of Ottoman poetry more closely resembled that of improvised jazz, where masters of the art render common themes in original ways. Around the turn to the 20th century, we see a shift toward a fidelity-based understanding of translation, which is more invested in questions of originality and authenticity, and which is really at the heart of self-internalized accusations of belatedness. What's interesting to me is that the Werther translations negotiate a more flexible concept of originality at a historical moment when conceptions of original versus translation hadn't perfectly solidified into oppositional terms in the late Ottoman realm. Thus, even as diverse Ottoman Turkish authors began to discuss translation in these terms, the actual practice of translation did not necessarily uphold this kind of binary distinction. So I read the Werther translations within the tradition of Tarjume, which encapsulated practices such as parallel poetry, call and response, and creative literary evaluation, among others. And in doing so, I suggest that these translations orient themselves toward one another rather than toward an authoritative original. And in doing so, they partake in a more flexible understanding of originality that also reflects back on the structure of Goethe's novel. So notably, Werther is a text that gained fame for Goethe in the German literary translation when it was translated first into French. The narrative of modern subjectivity in this novella can also be read as a discourse on translation and the impossibility of having a single unmediated narrative voice. The insertion of an editor at the close of the novel stages a break of the epistolary form and then points back to a lack of original documents. So the editor describes his efforts to reconstruct the last days of Werther's life before he commits suicide. And this is not uncommon for the epistolary form, but the insertion of this editorial voice in Werther is notable because it signals the introduction of multiple voices and mixed narrative forms into a narrative that had otherwise been univocal. Even more importantly, what's interesting to me is that the methods of translation used by the Ottoman translators, who freely omit passages, who change phrases and add emphases, these methods are actually closely in line with Goethe's own adaptation of Ottoman Turkish source texts, earlier in the century. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. To move my photos here. So on the left, you see one example from the May 26th letter that was translated by Ahmed Rasim. And what's interesting is that Rasim chooses, you see here, to maintain Goethe's reference to my Homer, Benim Omerim. And this may seem like a very minor issue, but it's notable that other authors like Mustafa Fazl and later Ali Kami Akyüz, who would translate this novella in its entirety, choose to not maintain this personal pronoun. And the personal pronoun is one of the subtle ways that Goethe expresses Werther's fatal egocentricity. So the decision to maintain this my is actually crucial to Rasim's emphasis in his translation on Werther's inherently romantic character. And this is underscored by Rasim's use of the word seylab, or flood, to describe the state of Werther's heart. By drawing a connection between Werther's uncontrollable intellectual fervor and this destructive character of raging water, Rasim actually foreshadows in his translation a flood, a real flood that will occur toward the close of the novel, and that is linked to the kind of flood of emotions that Werther feels. So in contrast, Mustafa Fazl omits all references to floods. And this is one passage, this is just one example on the right here that he omits completely from his translation. Read together, Rasim's and Fazl's translations reflect on larger problems of artistic self-expression and modern subjectivity, in either highlighting or downplaying the sentimental romantic tendencies of Werther's search for self. They bring out key tensions in the source text regarding his impossible desire for originality in the face of social convention. And this tension is particularly important for the passages translated by Hussein Danish, and in particular, this passage that I've chosen to share with you. And this passage also resonates with Hussein Danish's own assertion in the classics debate that no language's form and style could be represented in another. So according to Danish, translation can only ever transmit information, and the word he uses is bilgi. The May 10th letter, which you see a part of here, serves as a kind of meta-reflection on this very concept of untranslatability. So in the letter, Werther laments the impossibility of translating his feelings, these like sublime feelings that he derives from nature, onto the painter's canvas. He, of course, then goes on to describe this inability in detailed form in the letter. And so we might think of the words of his letter as a kind of impossible translation or an imperfect mirroring of his soul. So Danish's translation does not exactly mirror the syntax or the meaning of the original passage, but it does serve as a continuation of the passage's intent, particularly with regard to Danish's own views on the Ottoman language. So Danish argued in the classics debate that a classic can only be produced once a language has embodied the ideals of its nation. Then through a form of negative inversion, he claims that if classics did exist in Ottoman, the language would already have reached its highest level of maturity. And Danish's own use of Persian vocabulary and his tendency toward embellishment are in line with a longer history of divan poetry that he implicitly criticizes in his writing for not being reflective of Ottoman values. As such, his translation, in a way, expresses the relative stagnation of the Ottoman language and suggests that no other translation was possible due to a lack of appropriate syntax or structures. And yet, Danish's emphasis on his translation on making one's feelings public, so şair seni müştarak yüce hayret eden şu menazır-ı aliyeye niçin teşhirgahı beyana çıkaramıyorsun? And then later, meydana koyamaz mısın? So this emphasis on making one's feelings public, I think reflect actually importantly on the ending of Werther, the ending of Goethe's novel. So Werther attempts to escape the confines of bourgeois society and he moves to the countryside and lives by himself. And as he retreats from social life, it is his desire for the impossible, so his impossible love for the figure of Lotte, or his impossible desire to adequately express his feelings, that offer him this temporary confirmation of uniqueness. And yet, as I noted earlier, the many voices that enter the novel in its final pages clearly undermine any possibility of an unmediated narrative of the self. Danish's transformation of Werther's conversation with himself in the novella into a rhetorical question posed to the literary character by the writer here / translator is in line with the novel's ending. Danish opens the question posed in the novella to a broader context, which in turn speaks to the role of translation in opening a source text to an entirely new public. As such, the information or bilgi that Danish reveals is precisely a statement on the impossibility of an exact transmission of meaning in translation, even as his translation continues the meaning of the original in a new context. And so what I argue is that Danish's 1894 translation actually exceeds his later remarks in the classics debate. If the Ottoman concept of Tarjume was deproblematized following the establishment of the nation state, Danish's writings in the classics debate show that this shift toward a fidelity-based model of translation was already underway much earlier. And yet, while emphasis on accuracy and the impossibility of perfect translation in the classics debate is constitutive of this shift, his actual translations do not bear out this rigid distinction between original and translation. And so in the conclusion of this chapter, I argue that the kind of experimentation that we see on the ground in the translations of Werther are significant at this historical moment in which Goethe himself was being identified as a classic author. And the chapter then revisits this destabilizing focus of Goethe's Divan to ask what it means to also read the Ottoman Turkish translations of his work as world literature. And I argue here that by bringing Goethe's work into another cultural and linguistic realm, his Ottoman Turkish translators don't simply consecrate his role in an already established canon of world literature, but rather that they actively negotiate the terms of originality and cultural transformation that also inform his work. I gotta go next. So in the second section, I move into the turn of the century, and the chapters 3 and 4 cover sort of the full arc of Orientalist turned journalist Friedrich Schiller's career, from his decision to move to Constantinople in 1894 to his flight from this war-torn city in 1918. This is when he returns to Germany. And I offer insight into the life and legacy of this figure who is not very well known in Germany or otherwise, and who incidentally also translated the first full-length novel from Ottoman Turkish into German, and this was of Halide Edip Atavar's Yeni Turan in 1916. And I deal with Halide Edip's novel in chapter 4, and today I want to give you a kind of concise example from chapter 3, which examines the 1899 short story Yeğenim by Ahmet Hikmet Müftüoğlu, published on the eve of the 20th century. Following decades of political agitation for modernizing reforms in the Ottoman Empire, this short story weighs the consequences of losing one's cultural bearings amid far-reaching processes of societal reorientation. So this story is a satire of the superficially westernized Ottoman dandy, or the züppe. The Paris-educated nephew of this story returns to Istanbul only to undertake the spread of civilization, the term he uses is neşr-i medeniyet, among household members in the most absurd of ways. So he makes the maids unbutton the top of their blouses. He encourages the servants to shave their mustaches and don white gloves, among many other actions. As a figure fraught with the anxieties of westernization and the fear of cultural disorientation, the Ottoman dandy was an archetype of late Ottoman literature who generally took France as a site of reference. And so in my reading, I ask what new implications this story might gain in German translation, and what can it tell us about the German-Turkish relationship at the time? So notably, Schrader published this translation in 1908 in the newspaper, the Ottoman Lloyd. This official German newspaper placed emphasis on the exemplary quality of German education and technology. and the importance of German science for the development of the Ottoman Empire. And in this way, the newspaper sought to emphasize or sort of downplay any intent on Germany's part to exercise power over the Ottoman Empire. And so the newspaper sought to figure Germany as a neutral role model. Schrader's translation appeared in a literary supplement that he himself oversaw, and he translated the title as Der Kulturträger, and then in parentheses, mein Neffe. Der Kulturträger translates as the bearer of culture. This term is very interesting, Kulturträger. It was first used in the late 19th century to designate white middle-class Germans who undertook a Christianizing and moralizing mission in German-occupied East and Southwest Africa. It clearly displays an understanding of Germanness as more civilized and developed than indigenous African cultures. So the introduction of this word into the context of my nephew raises all kinds of questions regarding the Turkish emulation of European cultural models, and in particular, what it might mean for the Ottoman Empire to orient itself toward Germany. Okay, so within the body of the story, interestingly, Schrader uses a different term to translate Neşr-i Medeniyet. He uses the word zivilisatorische Aufgabe, which literally translates as civilizing duty. I see these as competing translations of the French term mission civilisatrice. And they're interesting because of the historical tendency for Germans to translate the French word for civilization through the German word Kultur. So the words civilization in French and Kultur in German originally had very similar meanings, each addressing a broad range of human achievements. But civilisation in French came to represent an ideal and finished civilized state during the French Enlightenment. And it was on this presumption of superiority that the concept of the civilized mission was justified. During the 19th century, Germans began to position a concept of Kultur or culture against this French definition of civilization. So the French word civilisation was universalistic and progressive, and Kultur came to represent individuality and had a non-political meaning in the German context. So read alone, Schrader's translation of Neşr-i Medeniyet as a civilizing duty with this word zivilisatorisch points back to the French term for civilizing mission. And by not using the word Kultur in the body of the story, Schrader might suggest that Kultur is above the teleology of history inherent in civilization. And then yet he goes and alters the story's title to read Der Kulturträger, upending this distinction. And this is particularly interesting with regard to the publishing history of this newspaper. So one main goal of the paper was to break the hegemony that France held as the foremost cultural influence in the late Ottoman Empire. And in order to reach a broader readership, Schrader really wanted to publish in both German and Ottoman Turkish, but it was too expensive to publish in the Perso-Arabic script. So ultimately, they decided to publish this 4-page summary of the German language text in French on the grounds that French was a widely spoken language, and in particular among non-Muslim constituents of the empire. So the ironies of this situation, I think, are readily apparent, and they open up an entirely new reading of the short story, in that they bring the nephew's feelings of inferiority vis-a-vis France to bear on Germany's relationship to France. This is compounded by the fact that Schrader translates Müftüoğlu's story out of the context of the repressive Hamidian regime in the late 19th century when it was written, and into the second constitutional era, which was ushered in by the 1908 revolution. The second constitutional era led to a loosening of censorship laws and a flourishing of the press landscape, and this is in part how a newspaper like the Ottoman Lloyd could come to be. But this new political era also left Germany on unsure footing due to its previously close relationship with Sultan Abdülhamid II. So whereas the figure of the Ottoman dandy stands as one response, we could say, to the anxiety of disorientation in the face of Turkish society's reorientation toward Western Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Schrader's translation exposes German anxiety regarding the efficacy of its own cultural influence in the Ottoman Empire. By taking on new and contested meanings in the socio-political context of shifting German-Ottoman relations in the Second Constitutional Era, I argue that Der Kulturträger also brings the multiple temporalities of translation to the fore. More importantly, and this is an argument that I developed sort of across the arc of Schrader's career in the book, by highlighting the non-neutrality of Germany's actions in the Ottoman Empire, Schrader's translation does not simply point to the Orientalist power of translation to contain or fixate a given textual tradition. On the contrary, it exposes the underlying goals of a newspaper like the Ottoman Lloyd, which was incidentally funded largely by the Deutsche Bank on the grounds that the Deutsche Bank had significant economic interests in the Ottoman Empire due to its funding of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. So together with his journalistic output, these aspects of Schrader's translation work, which clearly run astray of official German rhetoric of the time, prompt me to ask across chapters 3 and 4 what a non-hierarchical form of literary cultural exchange might look like. So in other words, is there a form of Ottoman Turkish German exchange that might dispense with the concept of a model toward which Ottoman Turkish culture in particular must orient itself? And is there a form of cultural exchange that does not begin at a given point of Western origin from which dialogue must ensue? And in the interest of time, I just want to point out some aspects of Schrader's career that highlight the multiple levels on which he engaged with literatures and local communities of the Ottoman Empire, and through which I see him working toward a more meaningful form of this kind of literary cultural exchange. So in addition to Turkish, he also learned Armenian, modern Greek, Arabic, and Persian during his nearly 30 years in Constantinople. He published numerous book reviews in the field of Ottoman history alongside articles on contemporary Ottoman Turkish literature, art, and theater. So you can see here one of his articles, just an excerpt from one of his articles on Namık Kemal. He was friends with contemporary authors such as Halide Edip Adıvar and Tevfik Fikret, and these relationships also led to translations like his translation of Yine Turan. He published a reflective set of essays on the multicultural history of Constantinople, which you see here have recently been translated into Turkish, and he himself undertook translations from Ottoman Turkish and Greek into German. He taught at the Armenian French Lycée, a position that may have facilitated his connections to the Armenian community. You can see here an ad from a performance of Schiller's The Robbers, Die Räuber, which he worked with a local Armenian theater troupe to put on. That was for the 150th anniversary of Schiller's birth. And finally, he directed a commission to catalog historic architectural sites in need of protection in Constantinople around 1916. All of these roles suggest Schrader's commitment to a form of cultural exchange that exceeds the structures of Orientalism and German economic imperialism. But it is through translation in particular where I locate the potential for Schrader to transcend his training as an Orientalist with an otherwise deep philological commitment to etymologies and origin stories. So I just want to give you a couple of examples from the final section. The last section of my book focuses on Sebatzen Ali, and the manner in which his literary reflections on Germany intersect with translations from German literature to provide a critique of the prevailing Europhilia of the time. And you can see Sebatzen Ali here in Berlin. He's second from the left with his friends. So chapter 5 looks at this little and not very well-known travel log, Mufassal Germanistan Seyahatnamesi, which records Sebatzen Ali's first impressions of Potsdam. And chapter 6 thinks through the intersections between Ali's translation of a Kleist novella and his final novel, Kirkmantel Modana. And both the translation and the novel were published in book format in 1943. So in the interest of time, I want to give you some examples from chapter 5. At the age of 21, Sebatzen Ali received a grant from the Republic of Turkey to study in Germany. One of several modernizing and secularizing initiatives at the time, this grant program aimed to foster the reorientation of Turkish culture toward Western Europe by educating a new youth in its languages and cultures. So Ali penned a private letter to friends back home detailing his train ride from Sirkeci train station through Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, as well as his arrival in and first impressions of Potsdam. So to give you a sense of the language of this travelogue, let me make an attempt to read this first line. Hudayı daim ül-vücud ve vacib üsücüda hamdi bi nihayeden sonra bu seyahatname mutavelenin sebebi tahririnin beyanına şuru edildi. So this opening praise to God, and as you probably note, his use of antiquated language for 1929 are just two examples of how Ali stylized his letter through the generic conventions of the Seyahatname. Ali's use of exaggeration throughout this letter also recalls the specific style of Evliya Çelebi, through which the genre received canonical status. Ali's later reference in this letter to Germany as Frangistan, or land of the Franks, also dates his style to a similar time frame, so to the 17th century, as Çelebi's writing. The title of Ali's letter is also an excellent example of the kind of humorous wordplay that he uses throughout. So this made-up word Germanistan plays on the word German, meaning Teutons or Germanic peoples who inhabited Northern Europe from approximately the 3rd to the 9th century. By referring to present-day Potsdam through this pseudo-historical name, Ali caricatures the essentialization of contemporary cultural identities through recourse to historical predecessors. More pointedly, he joins this word German with the Persian suffix stan, meaning land, thereby suggesting that the contours of German culture may also be shaped by aspects of the Persian language, which have then in turn been absorbed into Ottoman Turkish. So Ali's title, Germanistan Seyahatnamesi, provides a witty counterpoint to what I call his later translation of the place name Potsdam into the vocabulary of Ottoman Turkish. So I'll read this quote from the travelogue that demonstrates what I mean. Potsdam kelimesi iştikak-ı yûn-ı zamandan Hayrola Molla Bey'in tefsiri üzere put, sed, kelimelerinden mürekkep olup put, malum olduğu üzere kinai-i küfarda mevcut Hristios tasavviri ile heyakil makulesi esnamdır. Sed, kapamak, örtmek, setre elemek, valide, burada Meryem ana manasındadır. Cümlesi toplu olarak kübizm üzere Meryem valide esnama setre ele demek olur. So there is quite a bit going on in these short but hilarious lines. First, through reference to a fictional etymologist, Ali suggests that we search for the quote-unquote origins of the place name Potsdam in the Ottoman Turkish language. But the resulting word, Putsedum, which also mimics the Turkish pronunciation of a German word with difficult consonant clusters by sort of adding in these vowels, employs a kind of phonetic translation that disregards any original meaning of the word. The sound play of phonetic translation reveals rather the arbitrariness of language and allows new meanings to emerge where the proximate sounds of different languages meet. Ali's use of phonetic translation here is historically significant to the histories of Westernization and language reform, translation, and world literature in 1920s, 30s, and 40s Turkey. So Ali wrote the travelogue as a private letter to friends in 1929. This is just 1 year after the letter revolution of 1928. And notably, one way in which script reform was justified was through the perceived need to create a more phonetic form of writing for modern Turkish that would allow for one-to-one correspondence between letter and sound. So for example, the letters che and she serve as single letters as opposed to combinations like ch or sh. Nergis Ertürk describes this aspect of the letter revolution as the culmination of long-standing attempts to contain the Ottoman Turkish language by eradicating its ambiguities. Ali composed his travelogue in the old script in Rika handwriting, in the handwriting style, 1 year before it would become illegible to use in public as well as in private correspondence. He also wrote the travelogue on the eve of more radical language reforms in the 1930s, which sought to purge all foreign words from the language in an attempt to forge a modern Öztürkçe. A word such as putsedum takes recourse to the outdated grammar, vocabulary, and script of Ottoman Turkish to both showcase the depths of its expressive capacity and, importantly, to expose Potsdam as a site of translation for Ali's modernist imagination. Ali's tongue-in-cheek reference to cubism at the end of this quotation is significant in this regard. As an art form in which the subject is abstracted and represented from different perspectives, cubism allows a viewer to occupy multiple positions vis-a-vis a given single subject, thus rendering the subject as multiple. In short, it destabilizes the viewing practice in that it enables multiple forms of perspectival orientation simultaneously. By tracing the etymological origins of the place name Potsdam to the Turkish words putsedum by means of cubism, Ali insists on the need to view Potsdam as inherently multiple from a position that is itself inherently multiple. And I promise I'm coming to the end. I just want to explain how Ali's travelogue is fundamentally different from an emerging discourse on world literature in this time. So in the chapter, I look at a number of translation series that preceded the more well-known state-funded series Dünya Edebiyatından Tercümeler, which is launched in 1940, and for which Sebatzen Ali would actually later translate Kleist's short story. So you see here some of those series. The press and back matter for these earlier series reveal a nascent understanding of world literature as European literature in Turkish translation. And in contrast, Turkish literature, which is treated as a national literature of the new republic, is rarely, if ever, coded as world literature. So chapters 5 and 6 of my book both sort of outline how translation rhetoric of this time worked with other Westernizing reforms to provide grounds of orientation. It posited a stable external referent, understood as the West, toward which Turkish culture could orient itself, at the same time that the externality of this reference delineated Turkishness as a distinct and separate cultural realm. So this is the catalog for Remzi Publishing House's Dünya Muharirlerinden Tercümeler serisi. And in the back matter for this series, the publishing house identifies translation as a source of enrichment for a national culture, in particular translations from Western European literature, the success of which is predicated upon the translation of the most beautiful and famous works of Western literature into Turkish. And notably, in doing so, Remzi also addresses the question of orientation through this express purpose of giving our literature a new direction. So yeni bir istikamet. İsmail Habib Sevük's Avrupa Edebiyatı ve Biz, which was published in 1940 by Remzi, took the question of enrichment to an extreme. He called for a form of Tam Tarjume, which was premised on a bounded understanding of Europe and its literary canon, which we see as well in a term like Tam Avrupa, which also comes up in this book. Ultimately, he argued for the need to translate this canon into Turkish in its entirety in order for Turkey to be able to enter into the realm of European civilization. So both Remzi's publishing program and Ismail Habib Sevük underscore a mode of orientation that demands a one-way process of translation from Europe into the new Turkish nation state. On the contrary, Ali's travelogue enacts a dynamic, omnidirectional translation practice that stems from the instability of the cultures and languages in question. Enabling a form of multi-perspectival orientation, his practice of translation reveals culture itself to be inherently multiple. And this is significant, again, just to sum up, in that it lays the groundwork for an understanding of world literature as translation, as opposed to this more dominant understanding of world literature as European literature in Turkish translation. I'm going to stop here in the interest of time, but I hope that these select examples have given you a sense of what I mean by the creative power of translation to renegotiate the very terms of originality by linking traditions and times, places and categories in multiple ways. And this is precisely how I understand translation to be a powerful force of orientation, reorientation, and disorientation. Thank you so much. I think that was too long.
Thank you very much, Kristin. This, remarkable and insightful talk. I'm sure people are going to have lots of questions. I read your book as well, and I was just, so impressed with the opening. Actually, you didn't say anything about it.
I know, it was too complicated.
The opening is hilarious, and I hope others are going to read it. That's why I'm not going to give them any clues about it. But, in the book, you raise lots of questions about not, in translation studies or translation in different languages. This was a very, fruitful discussion for us because we look at what happens in Turkish literature, actually. So when you compare them, what's happening in German literature and Turkish at the same time, and the complex relationship between them, it has been, very, insightful talk for us. But, I liked your, use of reorientation, and when you are actually talking about that concept, you are offering a new, maybe look to the 19th century Turkish novel or Turkish literature as well, because you talk about the belatedness, but there are other also concept that we talk about it. So those things, I can say a lot about it, but maybe I will ask a question about what's going on with the concept of world literature, which you deal in your book, with these discussions as well, because you talk about discussions on world literature. And also, we didn't come to 2014, actually, when they started, retranslating, lots of, books from Turkish to German.
Yeah.
So there are lots of things to discuss, and I don't want to take over. So I'm going to give a chance for others to ask their questions first. Anybody wants to ask questions, or I need to start? No?
I can say something briefly about the concept of world literature. I spent a lot of time just looking to see when the word actually entered into Ottoman Turkish. There's one instance where the word Cihan Edebiyatı is used right around 1900 in a translation, but other than that, the word really, I didn't find instances of the word in practice until about 1930. And that's in Sırrı Levent's Edebiyat Tarihi Dersleri, and he sort of sets up the book in these alternating chapters. So there's like chapters on European literature, and those are the chapters on world literature.
Yeah.
And then there's these alternating chapters on pre-Turkish, so Islamic literature pre-13th century, and Turkish literature post-13th century. And this is to me a very clear demarcation of world literature and Turkish national literature. And this kind of demarcation gets picked up and reworked by different people in the 1930s. And it sort of plays out in these different translation series throughout the 1930s, in that they use different formations. Mostly Cihan and Dünya Edebiyatı come up in this time frame, but that they're predominantly translating from European literatures. And the Dünya Edebiyatı'ndan Tarjume serisi obviously translates from literatures other than just European, but the percentage is skewed. There's significantly more literatures from and Western, so Greek, ancient Greek, and Western European literatures in that series. And so there's a way that even in some of like obscure essays that I found, like obscure essays on Goethe and the concept of world literature, where Turkish authors will introduce this more capacious understanding of world literature that seems as if it will give room for Turkish literature to also be part of it, that they then also sort of come back to this concept of a bounded understanding of world literature as a canon that is somehow relegated to the West. And this is what I'm obviously interested in questions of practice as opposed to just theory. And this is where I see someone like Sebatzen Ali or the translators who are translating from Veritas as sort of engaging in a more dynamic understanding of world literature in practice, perhaps even before the term itself has really entered into usage. Does that make sense?
Yes. But even without naming it, Zeynep Uysal is here, you talked about, like classical discussions and
yeah, they're kind of skirting around the question.
Adamlar tartışması, actually, they are repositioning or reorienting, Turkish or Ottoman Turkish literature when they were talking about Turkish literature in relation to other literatures, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I would certainly agree with that. Yeah. I think that's what you see the authors who are translating the Veritas translations doing in their contributions to the classics. They're debating sort of what is a classic, which classics should we translate, what role should they serve, even without using the specific word for world literature.
Exactly. Yeah. The questions, there were also actually lots of maybe histories of different literatures, in the late 19th century, like French literature, or, German literature. Even they have Scandinavian literatures, for example. And these are in original. They are not, translations of specific texts from those literatures, actually. Am I going to be the only one who's talking to Kristin, or any questions? I was going to ask you about when you consider these, materials, both in Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, and in German, especially the extent that maybe Turkish texts were translated into German, and we now know that there have been lots of translation into different languages, French especially, and other translations, French translation from French and English, even Russian to Ottoman Turkish, and then Turkish later. When you compare this kind of, I don't know, I'm sure you don't have time to look at it, but what kind of impressions you get when you see all this, the materials, itself all together coming from different,
like everything that exists.
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking in a larger,
yeah.
I think that, so what was most interesting to me for the early translations from Ottoman Turkish into German is that they were undertaken by diplomats who were not trained. They were in dialogue with Orientalists, but they weren't explicitly trained as Orientalists at the university. And so it was interesting to me how someone like Dietz, that the memoirs from Asia that I showed you is like 800 pages long, and it's very eclectic. It's like he was working as an ambassador, as a diplomat in Constantinople, and he just kind of used his time to collect manuscripts. And it's just this very eclectic organization or collection of texts that don't speak, they don't fit explicitly with the paradigms of Orientalism. And that was something that was very interesting to me from the beginning. How could someone who's both sort of in dialogue with Orientalism also be using his position to not necessarily line up with it? Of course, Turkish, like there were texts translated from Ottoman Turkish into German in the 1800s, not a ton. Their sort of Turkish was like relegated below Arabic and Persian, even after the turn to these more classical languages. And so I was really interested in why. So why there's not so many. And it really is tied to the philological origins of Orientalism and the relationship of Orientalism to this investment in questions of national literature. And, Ottoman Turkish literature didn't line up with this. And so mostly I was interested in how this whole history of translation is linked to the problem of originality, that is linked to the concept of an original national literature. We see like a lot more translations being undertaken from Ottoman Turkish into German around 1900. And you see the first novel is translated as Halide Edip's Yeni Turan. There's a lot of translations. Actually. Yeah, there's like all the translations there's like a frenzy of translations.
And I was also moved by Ahmet Müftüoğlu's Yeğenim instead of, you had, Hüseyin Rahmi Gürpınar from example, dealing with the same theme. actually.
It's an interesting choice. And I don't know if it had to do with Schrader's personal connections, sort of. He undertook a lot of translations for like smaller publications, like he would translate short stories. And so I don't know if he was friends with Müftüoğlu, but he wrote like a whole introduction to it. He translated other short stories of Müftüoğlu's as well. But you see in the time frame, like post 1908, leading up to the World War, when Germany and the Ottoman Empire were allies, this whole host of translations obsessed with Turanism. And so you think like, this is the first novel to be translated from Ottoman Turkish, Yeni Turan, like all of Halide Edip's, this is an interesting choice, right? But it has a very political sort of undergirding that's really interesting. And what's most interesting to me is the way that Schrader actually rethinks his investment in Turanism after the war is over.
Yeah. There is also, these Turkic people coming from all over, Russia, and some of them going to Germany probably, like Ahmet Akçure and others.
Yeah.
Samet Ağol or whatever.
Yeah, there is this kind of
probably it might have something to do with, and those people were Turanids, so.
Yes, and they were publishing. They were publishing
exactly.
in these kind of.
They were publishing in Istanbul and in Germany.
Yeah, there are these kinds of like nationalist series. You can see articles, and there was like a real fervor and like extreme investment in the rise of a national Turkish literature, which is of course problematic. In that, the concept of a nation in and of itself, right, is really part and parcel of the whole story of originality and this investment in a kind of fidelity-based translation that the book tries to tell.
Yep. Mehmet Hocam, Deniz Hanım, questions related to...
I gave too much information.
I have questions, but I don't want to dominate, actually. If you have questions, I can ask one more question. Maybe you can think something actually. I was fascinated by Sebatzen Ali's, Seyahatname. What's happening there? It is a, serious piece of work, or he's just, It
was a letter. I mean, I don't think he ever intended it for publication. He mailed it as a letter to his friends.
Yes.
Back home. And Filiz Ali, I think she transliterated it. It was published in transliteration in 1970 in the volume Sebatzen Ali. It's rarely discussed. It's delightful. It's just like a delightful piece of writing. There's a point in the letter at the very beginning where he says, I've made an attempt to avail myself of the simplest language. And it's just hilarious because he's going out of his way to create these kinds of puns and phonetic translations. And I think it makes for a great counter to this history of Orientalist accusations that the Ottoman language is too difficult. And it's too multilingual. It's inherently unoriginal because it's too multilingual and it's too difficult to deal with. We don't want to translate it. And Sebatzen Ali is like embracing this difficulty. It's early, it's from 29, and it was never published in his lifetime. So I don't know that he ever intended to have it published. But it makes for a really interesting kind of comparison with Kırk in that these works sort of bookend his writing career in an interesting way.
Yes, and it's ironic that it was just 1 year after the alphabet reform, actually.
Yeah. No, it's pretty delightful.
There is a reading question. I don't want to, I can say so many things, but I don't want to just talk too much. Imran Gökçe Şahin has a question, reading question. First of all, thank you for this beautiful presentation. I want to know how to assess the notion of omnidirectional translation process in the context of Turkish-German authors or authors writing in Gastarbeiter experience. Did I say it correctly?
Gastarbeiter, yeah.
Okay. How does it continue from Sebatzen Ali's position, or do you see any continuation? You also work on Emine Sevgi Özdamar, for example, and her language is unique in the sense that She writes in German, but with a sense of Turkishness, for instance, full of Turkish idioms. Mm-hmm. On another note, how many questions it has? I don't know.
They're all related. It's okay. Yeah.
I want to ask whether you came up with translators or authors similar to Sebatzen Ali's position when translating Ottoman or Turkish into German. Thank you.
Okay, so I had originally conceived of this book as something that would go through to basically through the contemporary moment, through the Frankfurt Book Fair.
Yes.
Ultimately, I decided to not include texts by guest workers or, you know, second or third generation Turkish migrants to Germany, because that history is so explicitly marked by that history of migration, which sort of was different from the first 3 chapters in a way. I also had so much material that it made sense to end in 1946 with the end of the first instantiation of the Dünya Edebiyatı tercümeler serisi, Dünya Edebiyatından tercümeler serisi. But I do think that the concept of omnidirectional translation, as I discuss it, is really relevant to contemporary Turkish German literature. And so the article that I wrote on Zafer Şenocak's Köşk, for example, so he's an author who's recently started to publish in Turkish. He published 4 novels in Turkish and 2 collections of poetry. And there he's very much, so he has a Turkish figure post-1960 coup who ends up translating the literature of Ingeborg Bachmann in this Köşk on the Asian side of Istanbul. And the book is very much interested in questions of remembrance, thinking about how we might think through the relationship between histories of trauma, like the aftermath of the coup and World War II, which Bachmann is writing in the aftermath of. And so he's using translation as a way to sort of intervene in contemporary language debates in Germany, think through the history of language reform in Turkey, think through these histories of trauma. And so I think very much that even though I don't necessarily use it in that article, that this concept of omnidirectional translation really applies to Şenojak's work. And partly what's really important for me for this concept is that the histories of translation and the histories of trauma addressed they're not exactly synchronous. That translation is able to move across times, and it doesn't have to just move forward. It can also force us to think backward. So I think that's absolutely relevant. In terms of Özdamar, I've thought of it more in relation to the kind of like intertextual relationships she builds in her writing. And so the Strange Stars Stare to Earth, which is in Turkish, I think, 12 Yıldızlar Dünya Bakıyorlar, engages like in this kind of playful translative way with the German Jewish writer, Friedrich Schiller. And she's kind of like citing her poetry, but changing it and like putting it into new contexts. And there's a way in that novel that, because the novel starts in Istanbul and then moves to Germany, also narrator experiences a coup and then ends up moving in exile to Germany. There's a way that in that novel, Özdamar also wants to link disparate places and disparate times. And there she's sort of linking West and East Berlin with Istanbul and Jerusalem. She's creating a kind of a triad. And I think in the novel Zadzama Sterne, she does it less through this kind of translative language, which she really uses in her earlier work on Nadine, like which sounds very odd in German, because of the kind of direct translation that she uses. In her later work, I think she does it more intertextually and more subtly, but maybe even more powerfully because of all of the kinds of references that get built in. So I think, yes, absolutely. In contemporary Turkish German writing, at least the writing I've analyzed, this concept of omnidirectionality very often has to do with Holocaust remembrance. And this is really important because of the significance of Holocaust remembrance for the expression of belonging in Germany, and the way that migrants to Germany who've come after World War II have ironically been excluded from this. Like, well, you're not ethnic Germans, you're not part of this history of trauma. It's not your duty to remember the Holocaust. But in the same move, this acts as a way of excluding this new migrant community from being considered as German. And so the way that Turkish German authors take up this history is really important. There was another question. If there's if there's someone similar to Sebatzen Ali in Germany in the time frame, there's nobody as cool as Sebatzen Ali in the German context. Like hands down, he's so cool.
And we got rid of Sebatten Ali. That's the irony.
Well, you mean the state did?
Yeah, the Turks.
Yeah, that was a horrible murder.
Yeah, you can see, the coolest guy is gone.
I mean, he's special.
Let's talk about self-distraction.
Yeah, I think there's nobody, at least in the earlier time frame. Schrader is a really interesting figure, and there's like basically nothing written about him in the German. There's very little written about him in the German context, but he published a lot. He was a very prolific journalist, prolific translator. He was super active on the ground. I think he is a much more interesting kind of earlier Erich Auerbach, who lots of people have written about in the 1940s, because Auerbach wasn't really engaging with Turkish culture. So I think Schrader is really interesting, but I would not say he's as cool as Sebatzen Ali.
I will agree with you.
That's my assessment.
Sebatten Ali is the coolest. I think Zeynep Hanım has a question, Kristin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristin. It's a very inspiring talk. So I'd like to go back to your introduction, because I'm very curious about this, orientation, the concept of orientation. And can you say a few more words about, as a behavior or as an approach to West, so of Ottoman Turkish literature? Can you compare to influence or sort of other concepts of the approach of Turkish literature? How could you compare this kind of, orientation comparison to influence or this sort of concepts?
Yeah, so the concept of orientation is trying to get away from the concept of influence, because the concept of influence, in my understanding, is always leading towards this kind of understanding of Turkish literature as being infantilized. And so the introduction takes up, I can tell you what the introduction is about. It takes up questions of orientation in relation to the character of Bihruz Bey in Araba Sevdası, which is incidentally translated into German in 2014. And I'm really interested in how, so if we think about orientation in terms of phenomenology, the idea is that you orient yourself from your bodily position in space and time. And you're dependent on the intactness of your body in your ability to orient yourself outwards. And thinking about criticisms of a novel like Araba Sevdası, I'm interested in how the concept of orientation, like in the early Republican era, takes on this idea that we first proceed from an intact concept of the West before we can orient ourselves. And so it's kind of doing away with, even in the so-called return to the self, it's doing away with the idea of this sense of intact self that can then orient itself outwards. And what I want to show is that actually we need to do away with both. We need to do away with the intactness of the external reference and the intactness of the self, and show rather this kind of history of, ebb and flow, exchange, movement. And Araba Sevdası is a really interesting example because it's really challenging the concept of originality itself. What is the self that we turn back to? What is the role of the Ottoman dandy? And sort of that's how I go about developing the question of orientation. It becomes really interesting for me precisely because this novel, which has not been translated into another language that I know of, is translated into German in 2014 as part of this series that is translating the Ottoman classics, now translating Ottoman classics into German. And it's so interesting that there's all of these French words sort of strewn throughout Araba Sevdası that show Biros Bey's sort of Frankification. And the German translator actually does away with most of these and translates them into German. And so there's this really interesting way in that in 2014, this German translation is able to sort of relive the anxieties of German belatedness vis-a-vis France in the classical tradition and Turkish belatedness vis-a-vis France in this contemporary translation, for which German culture in no way stands as a model or an influence, right? I mean, France is the main influence in this novel, and Biros Bey has this dictionary that was undertaken by a British Orientalist. So Germany is not at all in this novel, and this contemporary translation is like inserting German culture in there and kind of asking us, what happens if we look back and think about the German-Turkish relationship? And I think, I also became really interested in questions of orientation because of the way that the Zübbe figure, like Biros Bey, is always understood as being disoriented in this strictly negative sense. And I became more interested in disorientation as a kind of productive destabilizing of these terms like East and West and translation and original, or original and translation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Zeynep Hanım. Zeynep Hocam. Questions? Can I ask, obviously, even though you are talking about very specific period and specific moments or texts or events, we can say, you are considering, 200, over 200 years of, contact, actually.
Well, not quite, 150.
Yeah, 150, but when you, yes, you are specifically writing about 150 years, and you select certain texts and certain events, certain, translators. But you are also looking, what's happening in the present, actually, in a way. So when you see all together, what are the implications of that, context that you are discussing for today, in a way?
I mean, the contemporary context is actually what inspired the book.
That's what I'm talking about, actually.
So we have particularly the Frankfurt Book Fair, which hosted Turkey as its guest of honor, sort of spurred on this new onslaught of translations from Turkish into German, especially if you think about, I don't have the exact numbers in my mind, but it's something like 260 translations from Ottoman Turkish and modern Turkish into German leading up to the time period surrounding the Frankfurt Book Fair.
Just a short comment, even they ask us what kind of, I gave them list, for example, when they were doing this project. They ask us which novel should be translated into German.
Yeah. And then there was this like burgeoning of translational interest around the fair. And I also talk in the epilogue about new series. So like the one for which Araba Sevdası was translated, there's also a new series called the Turkish Library, that invested, it was with Unionsverlag, the Swiss publisher, that invested a ton of money into really well edited and really well introduced translations. So I think that this contemporary relationship is what led me to look into the longer history of literary cultural exchange. And I think that's the most important thing I wanted to convey. I feel that the history of economic relations between Germany and the late Ottoman Empire and the history of military relations, like leading up to World War II, have been really well documented. But there's not a lot of literature on this cultural relationship, this literary cultural relationship. And I honestly, when I set out to write the book, was not sure how much I would find. And so it was kind of just like a process of discovering as I went. And I think, I wanted to show that even if there aren't as many translations from Ottoman Turkish into German as from Arabic or even Persian, that there is this really complex relationship that needs to be told, and that this relationship doesn't just neatly fit into the histories of Orientalism and Westernization, and that it kind of runs astray. There are obviously translations that fit into this, the discursive framework of Orientalism, but there are also others that run astray, and these are really interesting, and they tell us something about this Turkish-German relationship that we often assume to just not be there. You know, we often assume, like in the 19th century, there weren't really translations from German, like France was the main cultural influence. And in Germany, well, there weren't really a lot of translations from Ottoman Turkish. Okay, maybe there weren't a ton, but what are they doing, right? Was the kind of question that I was asking. And I think I did manage to show, I hope I did manage to show, there is this kind of sustained relationship. And there are a number of really interesting initiatives happening from, 1800 through the mid 20th century, at least. And then beyond, there's like a whole nother sort of chapter that begins with the history of guest worker migration.
Yeah. Actually, in the book, there are, besides this, there are lots of, crucial, questions. You touch on them, they open other questions. One of them that strikes me at the moment is this question of Orientalism or internalized Orientalism. When I look at the material from the 1860s, written by Ziya Pasha or Namık Kemal, and the way that they portray classical literature, they sound very Orientalist in a way. And my new point, I don't know whether you will whether you will agree with it or not, but I think Orientalists probably appropriated that discourse or narrative when they were looking at Ottoman classical Ottoman literature. So they learned from Ziya Pasha or Namık Kemal, like Gib, that you are talking about Gib and other Orientalists, and then they start to define or they look at the Ottoman classical literature as outdated or whatever you call it.
That is a really good question. So there's definitely earlier literature. So I would have to think. I would have to look into it.
There are some maybe earlier, but the extensive criticism that Namık Kemal bring to to classical Ottoman, I mean, you can't. He says everything.
I mean,
Namık Kemal, Ziya Pasha is the same, and so that's why sometimes like when you were looking at Araba Sevdası, I was thinking, Recaizade Mahmud is a disciple of Namık Kemal. What's happening there? So when you exaggerate Bihruz in that way, if there is any underlying implications there.
So I don't have the exact answer, but I think what I would say is that it's a bit of a give and take, because German Orientalists are definitely citing Namık Kemal.
Yes.
And they're both holding him up. They're holding Shinasi and they're holding Namık Kemal up as examples of this new nationalized or nationalizing Turkish literature. And someone like Schrader, very early in his career, because Schrader was a trained Orientalist, says, Namık Kemal is doing away with this paper language. He's bringing the language to life, right? And he expresses sort of very Orientalist ideas that he then sort of reformulates across his career.
Yeah.
But I do think that the Turkish authors were also coming on the heels of Orientalist criticism from much earlier, from the earlier 1800s as well, that had always referred to, so the word that always comes up is difficult, that Ottoman
and imitation.
Impenetrable. It's just imitating. And so there is a longer tradition of these kinds of criticisms, and I am honestly not exactly sure.
But parallel discussion is going on in the Ottoman context as well. What I don't know where it's coming from. Probably it's better to compare them. Tanpınar's, most of his critique of the classical literature is coming from Namık Kemal or the early Republican.
Yeah.
And then now we call them
Tanpınar's criticism of
Orient.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this is my gut feeling, is that these ideas were expressed in Orientalism, in Orientalist, like scholarly Orientalist texts very early on, but there is a kind of mutual influencing of each other in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. And it really begins to come to a head around 1900, and then the era leading up to the Young Turk Revolution. And so I think the answer would be, it's impossible to think of them separate from one another, which would, you know, again, tie into this concept of multi-directionality that I'm trying to develop in the book. I didn't sort of express it in exactly that way, but I think you're right that it's not, you know, a strictly one way sort of movement of internalization of.
I think your discussion is very balanced, but in Turkey, because of the current political situation, they blame everything the Orientalists, but, you know, they forget the fact that, you know, Orientalists, you know, relied on lots of things, you know, the local resources or local narratives.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. And that's something that, I don't know if you ended up reading the chapter on Yeğenim, but it talks about German translators, how they were basically incapable of translating materials without working with local authors in order to think about like dialect and spoken language. And those kinds of notes are really only legible in the notes to the translations, or sometimes in the introductions, but they kind of present themselves as all knowing. And then in the notes, it's like, oh, actually you had like 10 people helping you undertake this translation. So that's absolutely true.
Yes. Kristin, I'm going to stop here because it's getting late.
It's getting very late for you.
I don't want to tire you anymore.
But thank you so much for inviting me. This was lovely.
Thanks for coming. And hopefully we'll see you in the future more. On
either in Chicago or in Istanbul.
So you are always welcome to stop by, and we will have this kind of engaging, you know, discussions later.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for staying so late on your Monday evening to be with me today. Thank you, Halim, for inviting me.
Thanks for coming, and say hi to everybody. Take care.
I will. Bye-bye. Bye, Yüce.